Section 11 of The Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Mary Rhodey. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author. Edited and translated by Thomas Gordon, with introductory essays by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1, Discourse 8, of the general debasement of spirit and adulation which accompany power unlimited. Section 1, the motives of flattery considered, its vileness and whence it begins. I shall now say something of the extreme debasement of the Romans under the emperors. Flattery ever rises in proportion to power and fear. Where law and liberty reign, and men hold not their property and lives at the mercy of one or a few, this security begets in them a pride and stubbornness inconsistent with servility and adulation. Men do not flatter such as they dare own to be no better than themselves, or such as have no power to hurt them. Nor will they pay overmuch reverence to great titles which are not accompanied with great power, nor supported by superstition. For superstition enslaves as effectually as real power, and therefore confers it. Nor is tyranny ever so complete as when the chief magistrate is chief pontiff, as were the sultans of Egypt and Baghdad, or, which is the next thing, can create and depose him, as do the Turkish emperors. But where men hold their fortunes and lives at the mere mercy of another, they will fear him as much as they love themselves, and flatter him as much as they fear him. If his power be limited, their flattery will be limited, but boundless if his authority be so. Thus court and sycophancy prevail less under a mixed monarchy than under one that is despotic, in an aristocracy less than there, and less still in a popular state. Perfect equality quite destroys it. Complete sovereignty raises it to the highest. The more foolish and wicked a prince is, the more incense he will have. It is the surest way of pleasing a tyrant, as it sanctifies his iniquities and represents him to himself as worthy of all his grandeur and equal to all the highest offices of empire. Tiberius, who was a prince of great penetration, hated flattery because he knew it to be so, as he knew that they who paid him most, the senate and grandees, dreaded and therefore hated his power, as he who understood perfectly the nature and blessing of liberty would have dreaded and hated any man in his place had he been in theirs. He knew that flattery and hate often go together, so that they who possess the greatest hate profess the greatest affection. It is as much as their lives are worth to manifest any tokens of aversion, and the stronger it is, it will require the more art and assiduity to hide it. Julius Caesar was loaded with all sorts and every excess of honors, some that were divine, with design to make him odious, while they who conferred them abhorred him, and were concerting schemes to destroy him. With the same view, the like artifices were practised by the Senate towards his successor Octavius, afterwards Augustus, concerning whom the equivocal saying of Cicero could not but be remembered by Tiberius, "They should extol the youth and take him off." Hence, though Tiberius was irreconcilable to public liberty, he abominated flattery. He saw that flattery was the mere effect of bondage, and suiting only with the spirit of slaves, and though he would not part with the sovereignty, notwithstanding he often talked of it, as well as pretended great backwardness to accept it, yet he was ashamed of the vile and slavish abjectness of the Romans. But neither under Tiberius was there any security in abstaining from flattery. He was a prince infinitely jealous, and could brook no sort of opposition, nor even independence, and it was both necessary and dangerous to flatter him, but in my opinion not so dangerous as necessary. I mean to such as purely consulted their own safety, and to escape the rage of the tyrant. It is true, he despised flatterers, but he hurt them not. And it was natural for him to think, suspicious as he was, that such as would not flatter him scorned him. It is certain he never forgave free speakers, never could endure men of bold spirit, but, first or last, pursued them to destruction. It was perilous, says Tacitus, to practice no flattery, and perilous to practice too much. El Piso had inveighed against the corruptions of the state, particularly against the pestilent pursuits of the impleaders, who were daily arraigning and circumventing and menacing all men. He even threatened to quit Rome. Tiberius bore this calmly, nay, he descended to mollify him with kind words. But in a soul like his, brooding over vengeance, though he had suppressed the sallies of wrath, the deep impressions remained. Piso was a good while afterwards charged with treason, and, but for a natural death which opportunely intervened, must have suffered the pains of treason. Asinius Gallus incurred his rage for a motion in Senate which had really a compliment in it. Tiberius had in a letter to the fathers complained that from the plots and snares of his enemies he led a life full of dread and apprehensions. Gallus proposed to address the prince that he would explain his fears to the Senate, and permit them to remove the causes. This incensed him. Gallus too had piqued him before, and was suspected by him of aspiring views, and though he had notoriously flattered him, he could not by it redeem his life. As all corruptions in a state begin commonly from the grandees, or rather they are beginners of all corruption, so the grandees are the most signal flatterers. They are most in the eye of a prince, they are the most obnoxious to his jealousy, and thence the most prone to flatter him. A prince who governs, or would govern, by mere will, must countenance and employ such as ask no reasons for what he does, but commend all he does, and the more they have to get or lose, the lower they must stoop, the more they must praise. For this vile servitude of theirs they make reprisals upon the people, and are as terrible to those below them as fawning to those above them. For the most prostitute slaves are the most insolent tyrants, and it is from the same baseness of spirit that men oppress and flatter. It was truly said of Caligula that there never lived a more complacent slave, nor a more cruel and detestable master. Thus flattery is propagated, and infects all degrees of men. The prince awes the grandees, and by the grandees is flattered. The grandees oppress and terrify the people, and thence the people dread and adore the grandees. The bashaws are slaves to the great Turk, the people slaves to the bashaws. The insolence of slavish spirits is by Tacitus exemplified in Vitellius, among many other instances. He was always the foremost in flattery, ever assaulting every worthy patriot with reproaches, and ever struck silent when repulsed, agreeably to the genius of sycophants, to be both insulting and cowardly. This man, however, prospered by prostitution. He had great employments under Tiberius. He was a great favourite in the 2 succeeding reigns. He was thrice consul and once censor. Nor did the man want good talents and qualifications. In the government of provinces, says Tacitus, he exercised the integrity of a primitive Roman. But his dread of Caligula and complaisance to Claudius changed him into a filthy slave, and he is handed down to posterity as a pattern of the most infamous flattery, the just reward of his servile submission. His first and best actions were forgot, his last and worst remembered, and the excellences of his younger years obliterated by an old age drenched in servitude and iniquity. Besides his adoring Claudius as a god, he carried one of Messalina's sandals in his bosom continually, frequently kissed it, and amongst his household gods placed golden statues of Pallas and Narcissus, the emperor's freed slaves. This man was, I think, father to Vitellius, afterwards emperor. Such men such princes delight in. Regibus boni qua mali suspectiores sunt, semperque his aliena virtus formidulosa est, says Sallust. Section 2. Men of elevated minds, irreconcilable to arbitrary power, and thence suspected by it. The court paid to it, always insincere, sometimes expedient, but seldom observes any bounds. Agrippa told Augustus, according to Dion Cassius, that it was impossible for a man of great spirit and resolution to be other than a lover of liberty, and an enemy in his heart to an absolute master. Agrippa himself was that sort of man. He had courage enough to advise that prince to resign the sovereignty and restore public liberty. Such in truth was his credit and bravery, that Augustus thought himself no otherwise safe than either by killing him or taking him for his son-in-law. The emperor did more than give him his daughter. He assumed him partner in the tribunitial power, which, as the usurper and his successors manage it, was in effect the dictatorial power. The other great men of Rome he suspected and hated, though in vanity and for the praise of posterity he left them his heirs in the third degree. Augustus and Tiberius judged too well to imagine that the illustrious senators and chiefs of Rome, men who had scorned the alliance and affinity of kings, nay, treated kings as their creatures and dependents, could like a blind dependence upon one of their own citizens, who by usurpation and violence had made himself an enemy to all. Even in the reign of Tiberius there were Romans who thought themselves as good as him. Cnaeus Piso, for example, scarce gave place to him, and despised his sons, as men far beneath himself. But his haughty spirit cost him his life, for though Tiberius used him as a proper instrument to thwart and overthrow Germanicus, he afterwards turned that very service to the destruction of Piso. Affection can never accompany a submission which is forced, nor men submit willingly to a power which they think they have themselves a right to exercise. Hence the compliments and praises of these eminent Romans toward the emperors are generally by Tacitus derived from flattery, though sometimes necessary and sometimes well intended. Necessary when used for their own preservation, and well intended when employed to instill into the prince virtuous lessons of government. Marcus Terentius was perhaps justifiable when, in defence of his life, which was at stake, he made that high-flown compliment to Tiberius: "To thee the gods have granted the supreme disposal of things, and to us have left the glory of obedience." The senators also did well in magnifying some popular acts of Nero, that his youthful mind, being thus incited by the glory arising from light things, might court in it things which were greater. And Thrasea Paetus was justifiable, when in his speech about Antistius the praetor, arraigned for treason for lampooning the emperor, he extolled that prince's mercy in order to make him merciful. But as that which is only good in some certain degrees and exigencies seldom stops there, so this same flattery, no wise blamable under some circumstances, grew scandalous and excessive. It kept pace with all the frenzy and cruelties of these outrageous and inhuman tyrants, and by it their cruelties and frenzy were encouraged. The more mischievous and vile they were, the more they were adored. Dread of their fury had seized the souls of men, nor was any remedy sought against their fury but that of flattery. Men of slavish minds always began the detestable rout. Their example drew others after them. The lovers of liberty found it impossible to resist the many, and unsafe to distinguish themselves by opposition. Interest swayed some, example others, fear all, and at last it became a common strife who should be foremost in the race to servitude. All public spirit, all regard to the glory and good of Rome, the inseparable characteristic of the old free Romans, was now lost and forgot. It was converted into fear and anxiety of every man for himself. This will ever be the case when a prince, armed with sufficient powers, sets up his own interest against that of the state. Particulars having no longer anything to do with the public will study only to secure themselves. Section 3. The excessive power of the imperial freed slaves, with the scandalous submission and honors paid them by the Romans. As tyranny produces abject fear and anxiety in particulars for themselves, so from this selfish fear and anxiety come the beginning and progress of universal servitude, the extinction of all patriotism and honest zeal, the power of corruption, and the symptoms of a state hastening to ruin and desolation. All the good or evil which could befall any Roman lay wholly in the breast and option of the prince, and hence the study of every man to humour the prince or the slaves who governed him. For governed he generally was by slaves the vilest and most pestilent. Yes, the whole empire, that empire that contained a great share of the globe, and terrified almost the whole, was swayed, sold, oppressed, and exhausted by slaves bought from the chain and the oar. Claudius not only declared that affairs adjudged by his receivers should be held equally valid with those adjudged by himself, but got the same established by a solemn decree of Senate. Now these receivers of the emperors were his manumized slaves, who under that title often governed provinces. He raised the authority of these vermin to a pitch equal with that of the sovereign and the laws. Felix, governor of Judea, was a freed slave, the husband of 3 queens, and the brother of Pallas, another freed slave, who controlled the emperor, lay with the empress, and was master of the empire. So that Nero said pertinently of him, when he turned him out of office, that Pallas went to abdicate the sovereignty. Behold the debasement of the great and venerable Roman Senate. It is not enough that they flatter the emperor, and heap upon him powers and honors so great and manifold, that at last they have none for themselves, hardly any for him. They must likewise adore and enrich and exalt the fugitives and offscourings of the earth, insects naturally doomed to the vilest offices of the kitchen, stable, and privies. The Romans, lords of the world, must put their necks under the feet of the dregs of human race, for a contemptible project of that same Pallas about punishing ladies who married slaves, Varius Serranus, consul-elect, the first magistrate in the Roman world, moved the Senate to reward him with the ornaments of praetor, the next civil office in the state, and a present of near 100,000 pounds. To this motion it was added by Cornelius Scipio that Pallas should have public thanks, that he who descended from the old kings of Arcadia should to the service of the public thus postpone that his ancient nobility, and deign to be reckoned amongst the emperor's ministers. But Claudius averred that Pallas would rest content with the honours of the praetorship, and rejecting the present, choose to live in his usual poverty. The decree passed, was engraved in brass, and publicly hung up. A pompous decree, in which a fellow lately a bare-sooted slave, now worth 8 millions, was magnified for observing the laudable self-denial and parsimony of the primitive ages. Observe the strange inversion of all order and sense, dignity debased, infamy exalted, how low the awful authority of the Senate descended, how vilely the function of a consul prostituted, how ignominiously the glorious name of Scipio employed, how abominably the ornaments of magistracy defiled, an ordinance of state, big with servitude and lies, what stupidity in the emperor, what insolence in the slave, and what a melancholy failure of all virtue, truth, and liberty amongst all degrees of men. It was, in truth, a compliment made to a slave by a body of slaves, as Pliny well observes. We may guess at the villainy and evil deeds of the man by the enormous honours that were paid him, though we had no other rule or proof, as we have proofs enough. No such violent court was ever paid to Seneca, and Tigellinus had much more weight and authority than Burrus. Real goodness and merit beget in all good men real friendship and affection, and real affection is never so loud nor shewy as affection assumed. Where we sincerely like and esteem, we are not afraid of suspicion in the person esteemed, nor spend much breath and ceremony to convince him. But where we are conscious of our own insincerity, our professions are pompous and wordy. It was absolutely impossible that these vile upstarts should love the Senate, or any great men, great in blood or fortune or virtue, or the Senate or any great Roman could love such vile upstarts. But we see what disguises fear and falsehood can put on. Impartial posterity, which neither fears the Senate nor Pallas, can perceive nothing in the honours by them conferred upon him, but the infamy of both perpetuated. Nor was Claudius the only emperor who was thus led in bondage by his franchised bondmen. Others submitted to the same vassalage, to the same infamous counsellors. Pluric principles, says Pliny, libertorum erant servi, borum consiliis, borum nuture gebantur. Was not the world finely governed, and humankind completely happy, when the universal lord was swayed by the lust and nod of creatures just redeemed from the infamy of whips and fetters? The mighty Caesar, to whom the Romans owed all their ensuing misery and bondage, began the exaltation of such sons of earth, and in contempt of censure declared that if he had employed highwaymen and assassins to support his grandeur, he would in return have honoured them with the same favour. A true confession, but methinks not very politic. We have seen already whether his worthy successors did not actually do so, and what were the instrumenta regni, the bloody tools and machinery of absolute rule. Polycletus, a manumized slave of Nero's, when sent by his master to inspect the state of Britain, travelled with such an immense train that he was a burden to great nations, even those of Italy and Gaul. Section 4. The excessive flattery of the Senate, how ill judged. There was no mean in the flattery of the Senate. They might have been good courtiers, without being so abandoned courtiers. There are instances of their carrying questions against the spirit of the court and the efforts of favourites, in the worst reigns. Thus, in spite of all the power and caballing of Agrippina, they expelled Tarquitius Priscus, a creature of hers, from the Senate, in detestation of his base attack upon the life of Statilius Taurus, in subserviency to the Empress, who yearned after the wealth and fine gardens of that illustrious senator. Thus too in the case of Antistius the praetor, who had composed some virulent verses against Nero, and exposed them at a great entertainment, though he was impleaded of treason by Cossutianus Capito's son-in-law to that powerful minion Tigellinus, and though Junius Marullus, the consul-elect, moved that he might be doomed to die after the rigorous manner of antiquity, the Senate followed the milder motion of Thrasea for confiscation and exile, nor would they depart from the sentence even after they had received Nero's letter about it, though in it he manifested high indignation. They might have made some other efforts of this kind, where they made none. On the contrary, they gave away their liberties and voices faster than they could have been taken. But the honest boldness of Thrasea broke the bondage which hung upon the minds of others. So much can the example of one worthy man do, even in an assembly devoted to corruption and servitude. It is true Thrasea paid a severe after-reckoning, and it was the apprehension of that which stopped the mouths of others, or opened them only to fawn. But who would not choose the reputation and integrity of a patriot, that of a Thrasea, even at the expense of his fate, rather than the fortune and favour of the sycophant Vitellius, with the abjectness of his life and infamy of his name? Section 5. The free judgment of posterity a powerful warning to princes, to reign with moderation and to detest flatterers. The name and memory of the Roman tyrants how treated. All men have some vanity, and thence some fondness for fame. If they would acquire it, and avoid infamy, they must square their actions to the judgment of posterity. With posterity, little evasions, false colorings, and chicane will not pass for reasons, though they may with our contemporaries, who are often influenced by friendships, often engaged in parties, often warmed and misled by passion and partiality. Death and time destroy all artifices, dissipate all mists, and unveil mysteries. The intentions of men with all their motives and pursuits are then scanned and laid open. The flights of flattery will not then be termed fondness for the prince, nor the efforts of ambition miscalled public zeal. Claudius and Pallas, Tiberius and Sejanus, Nero and Tigellinus, men so caressed, applauded, and worshipped during their life and power, men who then employed all tongues in their praises, do now fill and have long filled the mouths of all men with detestation, and their hearts with abhorrence. What avail now their craft and subordinations, their power and high posts? Does the awe of purple, or the violence of the sword, do praetorian guards and perverted laws secure their memory, as they did their persons? Do I, for example, fear their charges of treason, or the vile breath of their informers, while I treat them as sanguinary monsters, as the tyrants, pests, and oppressors of the earth, as public curses and murderers in cold blood? These tyrants and their flatterers, though they pushed both tyranny and flattery as far as they would go, have not been able, with all their arts and terrors, to stifle the memory of men, nor restrain the speech. They are handed down to us under their proper titles. The Emperor Nero we seldom say, but the tyrant Nero is in every one's mouth, and the idea of a sycophant ever accompanies the name of Vitellius. His great credit and offices are forgot, or remembered only to his infamy. What a check must history and the censure of posterity be to a prince that has any reflection! Had Tiberius, Claudius, Caligula, and other imperial monsters considered what frightful lights they were like to be drawn into future times, it would have spoiled their pleasure in tyrannizing, and made them hate their flatterers, who persuaded them that all men, at least the best men, spoke of them as they themselves spoke. With regard to fame and posterity, it had been better for these wretches that they had never been born, as well as happy for humankind. Yet no man was ever a greater drudge for fame than Nero. Erat illi aeternitatis perpetuae fame cupido, sed inconsulia, says Suetonius. Witness his laborious fatigues in the theatre and circus, continued day after day, and often nights and days, for the reputation of a good singer, harper, and coachman. Caligula aspired to the like glory, and was a notable fencer, an assiduous dancer, as well as a charioteer. Laudable ambition for a prince, and as just and high as that of many others. Tiberius also wished and prayed for the praises and affectionate remembrance of posterity. How well he succeeded, we all know. He is detested as one of the most dangerous, false, and deliberate tyrants that ever afflicted men. Nay, he was no sooner known to be dead than the people broke forth into joy and execrations. Some cried, "Into the Tiber with Tiberius." Others besought Mother Earth and the infernal gods to allot him no mansion but amongst the damned and accursed. Others threatened to drag his body with hooks to the charnel of malefactors. And when his corpse was going to be removed from Misenum to Rome, every one cried aloud that it should rather be carried to the town of Attila, to be in the amphitheatre there thrown into a fire till it were half burned. Such were the marks of remembrance he had, and deserved, from the people. The other two are treated as frantic butchers, or rather as two mad dogs delighted with carnage and worrying, bent and active to kill and destroy. What is it to us that they were princes and emperors? Men of sense find no magic in names, but regard monsters as monsters, whatever titles fortune or flatterers gave them, or they themselves took. It is thus tyrants suffer the vengeance of after ages. And terrible vengeance it is to such as are tender of their renown, and seek immortality, as most princes do, and indeed have it forced upon them, since they stand too high, and do too much not to be remembered. Hence they ought to be more afraid of future censure, which is generally well grounded, and will certainly last, than of temporary praise, which is often false, consequently fleeting, at best to be suspected. Section 6. How lamentably princes are debauched and misled by flatterers. Now, if tyrants are abhorred, how much abhorrence is due to flatterers, who often change princes into tyrants, and make tyrants worse than they would be. Tiberius assumed the sovereignty with great diffidence, and his natural weariness would have probably made him mild against his nature, had not the Romans so readily offered him their necks and their persons to bondage. But when he found them devoted to slavery, he used them like slaves, and having nothing to fear from them, he only followed the vile bent of his own spirit. Domitian rejoiced when he found that Agricola had left him co-heir with his wife and daughter. He vainly thought it done out of judgment and choice and in pure regard to his person. So much was he corrupted and blinded by continual flattery, as to be utterly ignorant that no prince, but a bad one, was ever by a father tender of his issue and family assumed into heirship with them, as Pliny the younger well observes. Nero was in terrible agonies after he had murdered his mother. He dreaded the soldiery, the senate, and the people. But when, instead of danger and resentment, he met with flattering speeches from the officers, flattering decrees from the senate, popular processions, applauses, public devotions paid to all the deities, and universal acquiescence, his native insolence became more swelled, and from this general servitude, assuming the pride of victory, he ascended the Capitol, offered sacrifices, and thenceforth surrendered himself to the full sway of all his exorbitant lusts. When he had caused these two noble Romans, Plautus and Sylla, to be assassinated, he wrote to the Senate without mentioning the execution, only that they were two men of turbulent spirits, and what mighty care it cost him to secure the state. Instantly the obsequious fathers degraded from the Senate these dead senators, and ordained public prayers and sacrifices. Nero, upon the receiving of this decree, and finding that all his brutal iniquities and acts of blood passed for so many feats of renown, grew emboldened to do a thing which even Nero till then durst not do, and turned away the virtuous Octavia his wife, her by whom he held the emperem. Nay, when soon after the imperial butcher had ordered the blood of that illustrious innocent to be shed, thanks and oblations were again presented to the deities by an ordinance of senate. A particular, says Tacitus, which with this view I recount, that whoever reads the events of those times in this or any other history may take it for granted, that as often as the emperors commanded acts of cruelty, banishments, and assassinations, so often thanks and sacrifices were decreed to the gods. And those solemnities which were of old the marks and consequences of public victories and public felicity, were now so many sad marks of public slaughter and desolation. This was remarkably verified afterwards as well as now, and when Nero, upon the discovery of Piso's conspiracy, had spilt rivers of blood, and slain men by heaps, the fuller the city was of executions and funerals, the fuller too were the temples of sacrifices. One had lost a son, one a brother, or kinsman, or friend in this general butchery, and the greater their loss, the more gaiety they shewed, adorned their houses with laurel, frequented temples with thanksgiving, embraced the knees of the tyrant, and worried his hand with kisses. Nero took all this for so many sincere tokens of affection and joy, when, in truth, their congratulations and flattery were just in proportion to their severe sorrow. Section 7. The pestilent tendency of flattering counsels, and the glory of such as are sincere. What a poisonous thing is flattery! By it princes are misled into a persuasion that all their measures of oppression, all their acts of frenzy and rage, are just measures of government, that forced praise is real affection, that they themselves are popular when they are abhorred, and thus they are kept from repenting or amending, because, relying upon the assurances of flatterers, they cannot find that they have done amiss, or see anything to be mended. The flatterers of Nero ridiculed Seneca, and railed at him, and persuaded that prince he wanted no tutors. The same did the flatterers of Commodus in relation to the old counsellors, which had been his fathers. Nero and Commodus followed the advice of their flatterers, and reigned mischievously, and died tragically, and their memories are abhorred. Thus they are kept hoodwinked and secure, till the first thing they open their eyes upon is their throne tottering or overturned, and perhaps an executioner's knife at their breast. And even when things are come to that extremity, there will be those to misrepresent and flatter, as in the case of Galba. A few moments before he was massacred, he was soothed with false assurances of security. How pernicious, too, is such falsification even to those that practice it, since though they mean it out of selfishness and for security, yet by sanctifying upon all occasions the oppression and destruction of others, they do but invite their own. Whereas were matters laid honestly before princes, that this measure is a grievance, that an oppression, and that whatever is unjust to others is dangerous to themselves, they would prefer caution with safety, to humour and wilfulness accompanied with peril. They would grow into a habit of doubting, deliberating and inquiring, of submitting their own judgment to that of others, of remembering that they are what they are for the sake of their people, and that they ought to have no will nor interest but the public will and the public interest. Had Nero pursued the good rules of government dictated by Seneca and Burrus, and proposed by himself in his first speech to the Senate, had he avoided the counsels of that bloody and detestable sycophant Tigellinus, and of others like him, he might have ended his reign with as much renown as he began it, and left a memory revered as much as it is now detested, and with the confidence of princes, instead of debasing themselves into the characters of parasites, instead of abusing their trust, and bringing infamy upon their masters and themselves, would they, instead of this, give upright counsel, such as conduce to the good of all men. They would, besides the praise of well-doing, take the best method to secure themselves, their fortunes and families in the general security, or, should they be rewarded with disgrace or even with death, they would have the approbation of their own consciences, the applauses of the living, and the praises of posterity. But while they soothe the prince in his jealousies and violence, and encourage him in destroying such as he, or such as they fear or dislike, they set him a lesson and example for turning the edge of his fury upon themselves, whenever he becomes prompted by his humour or caprice, a case often happening, and always to be apprehended. The courtiers and flatterers of the Emperor Caracalla, to humour him, concurred with him in the murder of his brother Geta, and after that murder, though committed by his own hand, were themselves murdered for their wicked complaisance, and amongst them Letus, his favourite and confidant. Yet he was so far from remorse for shedding his brother's blood, that he massacred every friend and adherent to his brother, to the number of 20,000 in a short time. Tiberius, of all his friends, confidants, and counsellors, scarce let one escape in a violent end, unless where by a natural death they prevented it, and they who had been ministers of his tyranny hardly ever failed to fall by it. He indeed protected them from the resentment and prosecution of others, but he generally poured vengeance upon them himself. Vescularius Atticus and Julius Marinus were two of his most ancient intimates. They had accompanied him during his retirement at Rhodes, and never forsook him in his retreat at Caprea. They had abetted his tyranny and assisted him in his cruel counsels, nor does it appear that they had ever offended him by any good counsel. Vescularius was his manager and interagent in the perfidious plot to destroy that noble Roman Libo Drusus, and by the cooperation of Marinus, Sejanus had worked the overthrow of courteous Atticus. Was not all this merit enough, at least, to have redeemed their own lives? It was not. They fell themselves victims to his cruelty, as to satiate his cruelty they had made others fall. Ad mortem aguntur, quo letius acceptum, says Tacitus, sua exempla in consultores residisse. Their tragical end was followed with the more joy, for that upon their own heads had thus recoiled the precedents of their own traitorous devising. In truth, these instruments of cruelty are generally abhorred by the princes that use them. Anicetus, admiral of the galleys to Nero, conducted and perpetrated the murder of his mother Agrippina, and for a short space continued in some small favour with the prince, but was afterwards held in greater aversion, for, says Tacitus, the ministers of evil counsels are princes beheld as men whose looks continually upbraid them. Such too was the fate of Cleander under Commodus, who loved him, was governed by him, and cut off his head. How differently related is the fate of Burrus, suspected to have been poisoned by Nero. Mighty and lasting was the sorrow of Rome for his death, for the Romans remembered his virtues, and a little before, while the calamities of the public were growing daily more heavy and bitter, the resources of the public were diminished, and Burrus died. How nobly too is the tragedy of Seneca recounted. It is too long to find room here. I shall end this discourse with observing, that as flattery is the effect of dread and falsehood, as the most tyrannical princes are most flattered, and men of the falsest minds are the greatest flatterers, this consideration should be a lesson to princes and great men, to weigh the actions they do against the praises they receive, and if they find themselves righteous, they may conclude their panegyrics to be sincere. Let them reflect upon their acts of benevolence or oppression, and how they have used their people. They would also do well to examine what sort of men they are who praise them, whether men of virtue and honour, lovers of truth, lovers of their country and of humankind, or whether they are those unlimited sycophants whose custom and rule it is to extol at random all the sayings and doings of princes, worthy and unworthy. End of Discourse 8.